Sometimes, as world builders, what you're looking for is a concise definition of what you should think about when you're building in a specific historical era. Like if you want a Stone Age culture, or if you want a Renaissance culture, or maybe you're looking for some gas lamp type definitions. To answer this need, I have decided to start a new series on the channel called An Era Defined. And I'm going to start today by defining the Paleolithic and Mesolithic eras of our world with fantasy elements. So if you were looking to build a Stone Age culture of the hunter-gatherer type rather than the agricultural type, what would you need to have in your world to make it feel like it's genuinely part of that era? And then from there, we'll progress on to the rest of the eras. So welcome to An Era Defined, the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic by Just in Time Worlds, with your host, Marie Mullaney. Just on this type of video, I am not an archaeologist, I'm not a historian, I'm just an amateur who consumes an awful lot of content. So if an expert says something and I contradict that, chances are the expert is correct. I'm trying to approach the era and its defining characteristics from a fantasy world building perspective. And speaking of fantasy world building, this video is sponsored by World Anvil, which is a set of tools that helps you organize and define your world building online and will let you show that world building to other people. They have some really nice tools for organizing your history, including timelines, which is a great feature that allows you to link events with places on maps and a period in your time scale. And you can work in epochs if you want to go forward and backwards in huge chunks of your world's historical timeline. They also have some great world-building prompts, like the one on the screen now. And if you get stuck with that festival, remember, I do have a video about festivals. So thank you very much to World Anvil for sponsoring my content, and you can check them out on my link below. Okay, enough of that, let's crack on. So first let's talk about the basics of the Paleolithic era. This is a period where there was an ice age in our world. So it was cold, much of the fresh water was locked up in glaciers. The sea level was much, much, much lower than it is today. You could walk from Europe to Britain. Britain was not an island. You could also walk quite likely across the Bering Strait to Alaska. You could walk into the islands of Japan, even perhaps as far down as Australia. At the very least, you could probably reach the New Zealand islands and then from there make a much shorter, safer sea journey to the Australian continent. It was a very, very cold period of time, and for my kind of details on how to work with extreme cold, I did make a video about that, which you can check out in the information card. So the people who lived in this era were basically just starting their social organization that would ultimately culminate in agriculture and in societal organizations on the size of cities. At this point, their societal organization is small. But before we plunge into that, now that we have a basic idea of the weather and the climate, and that they're traveling around on these kind of tundra environments with grasses and not much by way of trees, let's talk about what they ate and the basics of their lives. The Paleolithic people largely were hunter-gatherers. They would have invested a lot of energy in hunting game, big and small. Things like guinea pigs and rabbits would have been equally as valuable in terms of a single meal as, say, a gazelle. But obviously, if you're hunting for your whole tribe, you want either a lot of rabbits or one big piece of prey. And many of their hunts would not have been about, say, an individual spearing a kill, so much as corralling an entire, say, herd of red deer and getting them into a blind canyon potentially and hunting them all. So they would have used fire as one of their primary tools to kind of frighten the deer into running into a blind canyon or running even into a constructed corral made potentially out of wood. Lumber would have been one of their big resources that they would really have appreciated. They would probably have hunted mammoths as well. Bringing down a mammoth would undoubtedly have been an endeavor for the whole tribe and one which would have great risk. Again, they would probably have used fire. At this point, control over fire is probably one of their most biggest technological advantages, bigger even than their weapon advantages. They would also have gathered nuts and berries and other such fruits, but you would also have started seeing towards the lower Paleolithic, when you're just before the Neolithic Revolution, you would have started to see a kind of agriculture where perhaps these people would be sowing seeds and then leaving. And then when they returned to this field where they'd sowed the seeds would be ready for them to harvest, having sprouted during the year while they were away at other hunting grounds. So you can potentially have that kind of activity where they're sowing seeds, leaving, coming back for the harvest, but not tending the crops, because that only comes later with the actual agricultural revolution, which is a very long revolution, but that period when you're actually starting to get sedentary agriculture. They would almost certainly have eaten seafood and fish. In fact, we have evidence that the first hooks, like to hook into a fish with, was probably made like 80,000 odd years ago, and it was a kind of a bone hook used in Africa in the lakes to spear fish with. So almost definitely you're looking at seafood. There's evidence that the San people of Africa ate mussels a very long time ago. So seafood, so for those tribes who live by the sea, seafood, hunting, and then gathering what you can. And of course, that includes digging for things like tubular roots, things like potatoes and sweet potatoes and those kind of tubular vegetation. In terms of the kind of shelter that these people found, of course, they did find shelter in caves. In Europe, there are many large caves showing where these people lived, the same in Asia. In fact, the same on all the continents. Everywhere where people went, they did find shelter in caves. But it is also quite likely that these people with their semi-nomadic lifestyle did have summer camps. So they quite likely went into the caves for the winter, for the really bad winter period. And then when summer came, they would have traveled and they would go to a summer camp. Maybe they had multiple summer camp areas so as not to overburden any particular area. And there they would have stayed in hide tents. So they would make tents probably using whalebone or mammoth tusks or things like that as the poles, and then leather for the tent sides. And they would have stayed in these summer camps for the entirety of the summer period. And this would probably have been the time when they mingled with other tribes and when they engaged in trade and when they got married and probably made sure that their caves' genetic diversity remained fairly stable. Not that they would have called it genetic diversity, but I'm pretty sure that humans figured out early that you shouldn't mate too close to each other, like bad things happen. So that's shelter and food. But what about clothes? Would these people have worn clothes? Well, probably. There's evidence that we started wearing clothes about 90,000 years ago. That evidence is based on the evolution of the louse. I kid you not, it's amazing. So head lice have been with us since forever, and you can see them in the archaeological record because they, have been fossilized along with all the other fossils that we find. But there's a specific kind of louse that lives in the seams of clothing. And they figure that louse's evolutionary period, when the head louse evolved from that louse to the louse that lives in the seams of clothing, was probably when we started wearing enough clothing to make this a viable ecological niche. So that was it was about 80,000 year-ish ago. So that was probably when we started wearing clothes on a regular basis. Now, the first clothes would undoubtedly have been fur or hide wraps, maybe, if the fur was scraped off. And it might have included like woven grass mats for additional insulation, because leather is not actually that warm. So in the Ice Age, you would either have wanted fur or perhaps lining made of grass, weaving grass together to make, a cape, or even things to stuff into your leather shoes in order to provide you some additional insulation against the weather. Now, just because their clothes were made of leather, that doesn't mean that those clothes were dull. They did understand dyes, and they probably did dye their clothes. So they would probably have known that ammonia can bleach hide, and of course you can get ammonia from pee. And they would undoubtedly have had red dye, because we know from the handprints that they left behind that they had access to ochre. They would also likely have decorated their clothes with seashells, maybe even with glass beads, especially those tribes that had access to volcanic glass. Because remember, at this point, they can't blow glass, they can't create their own glass. Their control over fire is enough to cook with and to harden pottery with, but it isn't enough to make glass with. But you can work with cold glass. You can cold work glass until it becomes a bead. So if you have naturally occurring glass like you do around a volcano, obsidian glass, you can work that into a bead that then you can string onto your clothing. And speaking of string, they almost certainly had access to a kind of rope made from plant material. We have a mammoth bone that has 4 holes drilled into it. And from the remains of the plant material in those holes, what they did was they forced plant material into those holes and then plaited them together to form a kind of rope. So they certainly made rope from things like nettles and flax and so on, and that could also have been used in their clothing and as additional decoration. So if you enjoyed that discussion of the basics of the Paleolithic people, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about their economics. So first, what were their raw resources? Of course, flint is a large part of this. Having access to flint means having access to the basic tool of this era. It is, after all, called the Stone Age. They would also have had access to clay and pottery. Now, at this point, it is very basic pottery. They don't have a pottery wheel, so they're just shaping the clay and then fire hardening it inside a fire. So it's hard and it probably retains water, but it's not pottery in the huge quantities that we see in the later Neolithic after the invention of the pottery wheel. But nonetheless, clay would have been a very great resource. So would grasslands and ranges. I think that having a hunting range for your tribe would have been very valuable, and I think that they would have defended their hunting range. This would not be something owned by an individual at this point. It would be a tribal range that you have access to because you are part of the tribe. Remember, at this point, you're not talking about the individual surviving. You're talking about the tribe surviving, because an individual by himself or by herself out on the tundra, their chance of survival is vanishingly small. Other resources, as I've mentioned, obsidian, of course, bone and ivory would also have been very treasured resources. Wood would be a scarce resource. If you're thinking about the kind of ice age climate, right, you're looking at grasslands, at tundra grasslands. You're not looking at high trees. Trees don't grow high in that extreme cold. That kind of woodlands would come much later. So for these people, wood would be a treasure. It would be a great resource to be able to live near one of these stunted, probably in our point of view, stunted forests. Wood would also have been very useful in the making of glue, and remember that they do use glue, especially in the later Stone Age, where they're flaking off tips and then attaching those tips to arrows and spears and so on. And they need glue for that attachment. And that glue would have come from things like the birch tree and so on. So they would have tapped into the birch tree in order to extract the sap and then use that sap to make glue. They could also potentially have supplemented that glue with things like beeswax. So having access to bee nests would also have been a valuable resource. During this time, the only animals that they would have had as a resource is potentially the wolf, the dog. We know that we domesticated them really early in the process. They might have access to cats. Cats were domesticated fairly early, or domesticated us, depending on how you look at cats. But so cats and dogs, maybe. Nothing else would be domesticated at this point. What you want to remember about these people is that they're still human. They're still going to want to flex their wealth and flex over their neighbors. And one of the ways in which they'll flex is with the time invested in their outfits. So things like a jerkin that has seashells worked on every inch of it would show how special you are, that you would sit all winter and make this jerkin. And if you then gave that as a gift to somebody else, that would be an enormous gift, because it would be the gift of your time spent making this thing. And since everything had to be done by extreme hand processes, this would be quite an investment. So if you're thinking about resources and about people giving gifts and so on, bear in mind that it would take enormous quantities of time to make these things, and it would be very valuable because of that. At this point, it's also important to think about labor, like what do people do, and to remember that at this point, everybody would do almost everything. Like, you might not be a flint napper, but you'd probably know how to nap flint. You would not have specialized labor, or at least you wouldn't have very much specialized labor. Most people, I would imagine, would be able to do most things, even if they weren't specialists in it, because there just isn't the kind of societal organization that results in specialization being viable. You have to be able to feed yourself if it comes down to it. And then I'm going to group technology into economics. So at this point, your technology is, of course, stone technology predominantly. But as I say, you would have pottery, which would be shaping of clay and then leaving it to dry in the fire. You would also have basket weaving as a very strong technology. So the creation of baskets by weaving grasses together, the creation of containers using grasses would definitely be a prized skill and technology. You also have to consider your stone tools, whether these people are at the point where they're making cores or not. So cores were basically when you shape a bigger stone and then you kind of flake off like multiples in the same shape. So it's kind of like a production line for the Stone Age. Very elementary, of course. What you need to remember as well is that once they start attaching stone tips onto arrows and stone tips onto spears and so on, the valuable part is not the tip. You can get flint much more easily than you can get wood. And that's why we see in the archaeological record that spears became detachable. So the spear had a tip that you would put into the long shaft portion. And if something breaks, it would be the tip that breaks, while the long shaft portion continues to function. And the reason for that is twofold. One, of course, as I said, wood was a scarce resource, but also remember what I said about time. Now, it takes time to straighten a piece of wood to be a spear shaft. And it especially takes time when you're working with stone tools. So if something on your weapon is going to break, you want it to be the thing that is easy and cheap to replace in terms of one of your most valuable resources, time. So think about that in terms of your weapon design if you're building these weapons. They would probably have attached tips and would have constructed the weapon in such a way that the part that is hardest to make, that takes the longest, is the part that is preserved, even if that is something that we would think of as a common material like wood. Bows and arrows would have been common, slings would have been common weapons, spears, of course, starting as fire-hardened sticks and ending up, as I said, with these detachable tips. There's also evidence that they adapted the sling to be a spear thrower type thing that rested on your arm and then you flung the spear with it. So these are basic projectile weapons, but they definitely had access to projectile weapons. Bear in mind that there would have been nothing like a stone sword or anything like that, simply because it would be too heavy. So the tips of things would have been stone, but not the entire length or the entire shaft of it. And then the last point on the economy is, how did these people trade? So here you have to remember that they probably had at best a barter economy. There was almost certainly no currency at all whatsoever. I doubt that they had any concept of currency. If we look at the San people of Southern Africa, they have a culture of gift giving. So their economics, such as it is, was based on, I will give you a gift. There is no expectation of return, but someday in the future, you might give me a gift, or you will give me a gift, because that is the culture. So it's a culture where there is an expectation, but it's not a direct expectation. It's not like, I'm giving you this gift and you're giving me that gift. That would be barter. This is, I have plenty, so I will give it to you as a gift. And in the future, when you have plenty and I have little, you will give me a gift. It is a very high trust-based economic model, and one that doesn't work if you don't have a high trust society, an extremely high trust society, of course. Those early societies would likely have been high trust just because there were so few people comparative to the vast resources available to them. I doubt that there was much conflict over resources, given how much resources there were and how few people there were to consume them. So you wouldn't have had that kind of competitive drive that creates some of your more crime-filled or societies. You probably would not have had a merchant type class, but I'm sure that adventurers did travel between various societies. So you'd have people traveling from one cave to another cave, or from one tribe to another tribe, and they would undoubtedly take items from their home tribe to another tribe and bring from that tribe back to their home tribe. So you would have that kind of informal travel, but there would be nothing like trade routes or merchants at this point. And if you enjoyed that discussion of Stone Age economics, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about societal organization. So at this point of the societal organization, you're probably looking at extended families that travel together in small tribes. I don't think you're looking at very large tribes. I think those tribes might come together at summer camps in kind of clan gatherings or in larger people meetings. But for the majority of the time, it would probably be 20 to 30 families together in a tribe. And by families, I mean extended families. So grandparents, parents, uncles and aunts, like probably about 10, 15 people in a family. And then that would travel together in groups of about 10 to 20 families, I would think. You don't need that much organization for that kind of setup. You would probably have a kind of a chief, or maybe your shaman would fill that role, and they almost certainly did have shamans. And your decisions of the tribe would likely have taken with everybody of the tribe coming together and a sort of consensus-driven democracy being how you make decisions as a tribe. In terms of building things together or creating things together, Göbekli Tepe was probably built by like a clan or a multitude of tribes. This is a site in Turkey that is absolutely amazing. It has these T-shaped stone monoliths on it, big stone monoliths with animals carved onto its surface. And it seems to be some kind of monument or maybe some kind of spiritual place. And it doesn't appear to have been a place where people lived. So it was built by these semi-nomadic people, and they built it and went there intermittently. So perhaps to worship these animal spirits, perhaps to give thanks for certain events. Maybe it was a place you went to for moments in life or moments in your tribe's life. We don't know at this point. But sites like that give me the idea that maybe if you have a hunter-gatherer society, you could potentially look at having seasonal cities, places where these hunter-gatherers gather, excuse the pun, in certain seasons in order to build some kind of a monument that looks like a city but is actually just a place of religious significance, or a monument to past leaders, or a place you go to worship the spirits, or whatever the case may be. So that is a very interesting thought to play around with in terms of your hunter-gatherer culture. In terms of the equality of the society, it is likely that hunter-gatherer societies were pretty egalitarian. We are not sexually very dimorphic as a species, so they probably hunted side by side, women and men. They probably gathered side by side, women and men. They probably shared labor fairly equally between the two sexes. And because there was no real material stuff to pass down generation to generation, you're not building generational wealth, I don't think there was any particular drive to ensure that your mate's children are your children, because they would have thought in terms of the tribe survival. And of course, the genetic survival is met simply by having a mate and, doing the devil's tango on a fairly regular basis. You're going to pass your genes along. In terms of things like crime and punishment, I'm pretty certain that they had very few. Probably all of the crime and punishment was orientated around things like betraying the tribe or putting the tribe in danger. I think their worst punishment would probably have been exile, which would be tantamount to a death sentence because of the nature of survival in this era and your need for other people to help you. The whole tribe would probably get involved in trials, and it would again probably be a sort of consensus decision as to what to do with the criminal. And then in terms of religion, I'm pretty certain that they practiced animism and shamanism, maybe also a form of ancestor worship, but I would lean heavily on the animism and the totemism. And if you want to know what totemism and animism is and how to incorporate it into your world, I did do videos on that. Check them out in the information cards. It's also very notable that we have found spread throughout Eurasia these Venus figurines that seem to be some kind of perhaps female fertility figure, perhaps some kind of Mother Nature figure, something like that. So there was certainly some kind of shared understanding of some form of iconography that to me speaks of some kind of agreed on religion, perhaps something like a Mother Nature, as I say, or some kind of fertility ritual. Or it might have been a component of a belief in sympathetic magic, like if we make this fertility symbol and we plant it in our house will be fertile. So it could potentially have been such a sympathetic magic for green. I also want to say here, if you have shamans in your world, it is very worth thinking about whether people who are born different become shamans, because that seems to be what the archaeological records indicate. So, for example, somebody who might be born with, say, a deformed limb might have become a shaman. Or somebody who was born hermaphrodite with both male and female equipment might very well have become a shaman and been considered, somebody who is particularly blessed in understanding both man and woman or in fertility, etc., etc. So it's worth thinking about things like that in terms of your shamans, whether they consider people born like that to be destined to be shamans. Their religion would have been all about interpreting the natural world, making sense of their lives, the fire mountains and the spirits of the rivers, etc., etc. So think about that kind of naturalistic type religions. And if you enjoyed that discussion of the organization, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about the cultural aspects. We know that they left behind art. We know that because we see it on the cave walls. And some of that art is beautiful. It is gorgeously done paintings of animals. We also see the handprints, the red ochre handprints, which those are amazing. It is such an intimate thing to leave behind, your handprint on a wall. They also had clay, which they could shape and put some crenellations and decorations on before firing it. They would also probably have used baskets and basket weaving as a form of art. And they would have done beadwork on clothing as a form of visual art. Again, all of the time involved in preparing seashells, drilling a hole in them, tying them onto the cloth, all of that would have gone into the wealth represented by this item. They also probably had music, and I don't just mean singing. We have bone flutes going back thousands, tens of thousands of years. Bone flutes, clay flutes, probably also drums of various sorts, starting with, say, wooden logs, and then eventually reaching, skins stretched over a frame. So I think drums and flutes would have been your early instruments for music. And I think that their performing arts would have included things like shadow play in front of the fire. Remember that fire would be very central to their lives. Making fire is hard without things like matches. Even if you've got, the technology of fire stones, it's still hard. That kind of performing art that incorporates this thing that is so important in your life, this fire, would be a thing that would speak to them, I think, in terms of their cultural soul. So it's worth thinking about kind of performing arts that include fire. And then, of course, the moments in life. So when people were born, it's unlikely that they were immediately named. They would probably wait for a year or two to ensure that the child was actually going to survive. Bear in mind that your infant mortality would have been very high at this point. So it might have been a case of don't get too attached until the spirits decide that this one is really staying. So it might be that you have a naming ceremony after the child has survived for, a year or two. Of course, we know that they buried people because we have burial sites. So, and they buried them with grave goods, and they buried them with red ochre, and there was ceremony involved in this. Burial is probably one of the earliest forms of societal expression. And I did do a video on burial in general, which you can check out in the information card. But definitely think about how they bury people. It's also likely that they had some kind of a mating ritual. I don't know whether they'd have had lifetime marriages, but they would definitely have had some kind of a mating ritual to, indicate that two people are now a couple. If they had couple marriages, I would imagine that they would practice polygyny, maybe polyamory, depending on your resource setup. They probably also had a manhood ceremony for boys, who become men, and they probably had a womanhood ceremony for when a girl first gets her period. I think those two are pretty much a given. And if you enjoyed that discussion about culture, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about magic, because this is fantasy world building. So, I cannot overstate the importance of fire in these cultures, but I also cannot overstate the importance of not making your magic system of such a nature that they have complete control over fire. Because if you do that, you will move out of the Stone Age very fast. One of the limiting factors of the Stone Age is how much heat you can generate in a fire. Because once you can generate enough heat to smelt ore, you will almost instantly move into the Copper Age. Copper was pretty freely available. You could get copper ingots, but you cannot smelt them if you don't have enough control of a fire to generate a high enough heat for that. So bear that in mind when you're designing your magic system. If these people have complete control over fire with a magic system, you are out of the Stone Age very fast. You're probably looking at a shamanistic magic system, something like calling the spirits, calling the animals to the hunt, maybe a naturalistic one, perhaps some kind of alchemical base where you're working with natural substances, you're getting people high, healing people. That kind of magic system would fit very well, in my opinion. I think you're also looking at a component magic system, and I could see a spirit entreaty magic system working, where you have certain totemistic spirits, you tie that into your religion, you entreat the totems and the spirits, and they then do what you ask them to do if you have done sufficient sacrifices to the spirits. Remember that at this point, you're not looking at any kind of like study-based magic system. So it'll all be kind of experimentation and naturalism and passed down from master to apprentice, from shaman to apprentice, etc. So very much a kind of informal naturalistic magic system. And if you enjoyed that discussion of magic systems, hit the thumbs up button. So things to remember when you're doing a Stone Age culture is that this is a nomadic culture, at the very least semi-nomadic. Their possessions will be mobile. They must be able to pick up what they own and travel with it. You're looking for a naturalistic magic system, as I said. Your wealth would be flexed in time spent creating things. And they would probably value the community over the individual. It would probably be a society where we are more important than I. And their language and attitudes and cultures and sayings would reflect that importance. And those were my thoughts on the Stone Age in fantasy. If you would like my help in building your world, check out my Ko-fi page and you can engage my services there. If you would like to help this channel directly, hit the join button for some great perks, or you can buy my books, which also helps this channel. Remember to leave a review. And if you enjoyed this video, maybe check out my video on totemism in fantasy, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.